Charlie Johnson ruled the city without ever raising his voice. He didn't need to. Power bent toward him naturally, like iron filings to a magnet. Men who had survived wars and prison riots lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Deals worth millions were settled with a nod. Threats were delivered through silence, and silence was always enough. They said Charlie's quiet nature was deliberate, calculated, a psychological weapon sharpened over decades. When he sat across from someone, unreadable and still, the absence of words became unbearable. People talked too much around him, filling the space he refused to occupy, revealing fears they never meant to confess. That was how he stayed ahead, by letting others drown in their own noise. What no one knew was that the silence surrounding Charlie was not a choice. It was a condition, one he had carried since birth. He had never heard the city he owned, never heard the crack of gunfire that decided territorial disputes, or the sirens that chased his men through back streets at night. Never heard laughter at celebrations, or the final breaths of people who vanished under his command. Sound was an abstract concept to him, something he understood intellectually, not emotionally. His world was built on sight, vibration, and instinct. Charlie learned early how to compensate. He read lips with unnerving accuracy, memorizing faces the way others memorized voices. He studied posture, micro-expressions, the way shoulders tightened when someone lied. He felt footsteps through the floor, sensed tension through movement, detected danger before it spoke its name. What he lacked in hearing he replaced with observation, and then sharpened it into something lethal. The mansion where he lived reflected that control. Everything was ordered, predictable, restrained. Guards moved with disciplined precision. Staff spoke only when necessary, careful not to attract attention. Even those who didn't know his secret felt the weight of his presence, as if the walls themselves demanded restraint. That morning, Charlie sat in his private study, reviewing reports laid neatly across his desk. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, illuminating the sharp lines of his tailored suit and the faint scars inked across his chest where his shirt lay slightly open. His posture was relaxed, but his attention was absolute. Nothing happened in his city without eventually passing through his hands. Behind him, the room was quiet in the way he preferred, controlled, contained, obedient. He didn't notice the new maid at first. She moved carefully, aware of where she stood and who he was. Most people did. But as she worked, something about the room shifted. A pause too long, a presence lingering where it shouldn't. Charlie didn't turn. He didn't have to. He felt it. For the first time that morning, the king of silence sensed disruption approaching, small, human, and utterly unexpected. Silence was not emptiness to Charlie Johnson. It was texture, weight, and rhythm. He woke to it every morning, not to alarms or voices, but to light shifting through curtains and the familiar vibration of his phone against the nightstand. He had learned long ago that the world announced itself in ways other than sound, through movement, through patterns, through subtle disruptions that most people never noticed because they were too busy listening. As a child, he had watched other kids react to things he could not perceive. They laughed suddenly, flinched for no visible reason, turned their heads toward invisible cues. Doctors explained it with sympathetic eyes and measured words he read from their lips. Congenital deafness, permanent, irreversible. His parents learned sign language. Teachers adapted. The world adjusted around him, but never quite enough. There was always a delay, a gap between him and everyone else, a reminder that something fundamental was missing. That gap shaped him. Charlie grew inward where others grew outward. While other boys spoke, he observed. While they shouted, he planned. He noticed how authority shifted when a room fell quiet, how people filled silence with truth.
By the time he was a teenager, he understood something powerful. Silence made people uncomfortable, and discomfort made them predictable. When the streets claimed him, that lesson became survival. Criminal life was loud in every way except the one that mattered. Arguments, bravado, threats, none of it reached him, but he saw everything. He saw hands twitch before knives appeared, lips form lies before loyalty collapsed, eyes dart when courage failed. His deafness became a filter, stripping away distraction until only intent remained. Men underestimated him at first. They mistook his calm for weakness, his quiet for ignorance. That mistake rarely happened twice. Charlie built his reputation not on violence, but on inevitability. When he acted, it was precise. When he punished, it was final. People learned that silence did not mean mercy. Still, there were moments, rare, private ones, when the absence of sound felt like a loss rather than an advantage. Watching a woman laugh without knowing why, feeling a room vibrate with energy he could not fully access, standing in the rain and wondering what it would be like to hear it fall, instead of merely feeling its cold insistence against his skin. He never spoke of those moments. Vulnerability had no place in his world. He accepted the condition as fate, as something decided before he had a chance to resist. Doctors had told him nothing could be done. He believed them. Trust, once given, was hard to reclaim. So Charlie built an empire that did not require hearing. He mastered a world of signals and shadows, of looks and gestures and unspoken rules. Silence became his crown, his shield, his language. He did not know, could not know, that the silence he lived in was not entirely natural, that somewhere along the way a small hidden obstruction had rewritten his destiny, and that one ordinary act, performed by someone with no power at all, was about to tear that silence apart.
0.8 was not emptiness to Charlie Johnson. It was texture, weight, and rhythm. He woke to it every morning, not to alarms or voices, but to light shifting through curtains and the familiar vibration of his phone against the nightstand. He had learned long ago that the world announced itself in ways other than sound, through movement, through patterns, through subtle disruptions that most people never noticed because they were too busy listening. As a child, he had watched other kids react to things he could not perceive. They laughed suddenly, flinched for no visible reason, turned their heads toward invisible cues. Doctors explained it with sympathetic eyes and measured words he read from their lips. Congenital deafness. Permanent. Irreversible. His parents learned sign language. Teachers adapted. The world adjusted around him, but never quite enough. There was always a delay, a gap between him and everyone else, a reminder that something fundamental was missing. That gap shaped him. Charlie grew inward where others grew outward. While other boys spoke, he observed. While they shouted, he planned. He noticed how authority shifted when a room fell quiet, how people filled silence with truth. By the time he was a teenager, he understood something powerful. Silence made people uncomfortable, and discomfort made them predictable. When the streets claimed him, that lesson became survival. Criminal life was loud in every way, except the one that mattered. Arguments, bravado, threats, none of it reached him. But he saw everything. He saw hands twitch before knives appeared, lips form lies before loyalty collapsed, eyes dart when courage failed. His deafness became a filter, stripping away distraction until only intent remained. Men underestimated him at first. They mistook his calm for weakness, his quiet for ignorance.
That mistake rarely happened twice. Charlie built his reputation not on violence, but on inevitability. When he acted, it was precise. When he punished, it was final. People learned that silence did not mean mercy. Still, there were moments, rare, private ones, when the absence of sound felt like a loss rather than an advantage. Watching a woman laugh without knowing why, feeling a room vibrate with energy he could not fully access, standing in the rain and wondering what it would be like to hear it fall, instead of merely feeling its cold insistence against his skin. He never spoke of those moments. Vulnerability had no place in his world. He accepted the condition as fate, as something decided before he ever had a chance to resist. Doctors had told him nothing could be done. He believed them. Trust, once given, was hard to reclaim. So Charlie built an empire that did not require hearing. He mastered a world of signals and shadows, of looks and gestures and unspoken rules. Silence became his crown, his shield, his language. He did not know, could not know, that the silence he lived in was not entirely natural, that somewhere along the way a small hidden obstruction had rewritten his destiny, and that one ordinary act, performed by someone with no power at all, was about to tear that silence apart.
Jennifer tried to ignore it at first. In a house like this, noticing too much could get you dismissed, or worse. She finished her task, stood slowly, and backed away from the chair with her eyes lowered. But the image stayed with her, sharp and insistent, replaying itself no matter how hard she tried to focus on anything else. That night, she barely slept. By morning, her certainty had grown heavier, no longer a suspicion, but a quiet alarm ringing inside her chest. When she returned to the study the next day, her hands trembled despite her effort to stay composed. Charlie Johnson sat in the same place, the same posture, as if time bent around him. Light from the window traced the edge of his face, and there it was again, subtle, unnatural, just behind the curve of his ear. She moved with purpose now, slower than before, angling herself to confirm what her instincts had already accepted. It wasn't skin, it wasn't bone, it was something lodged where it didn't belong, concealed so well that only someone looking from the right angle would ever notice. Jennifer swallowed hard. If she was right, this wasn't a flaw, it was interference. Her heart pounded as she weighed the risk. Touching him without permission was forbidden. Touching his head was unthinkable. Yet the memory of her brother flooded back. Countless appointments, specialists, devices, mistakes made by people who swore they knew better. She had learned that silence was not always fate. Sometimes it was neglect. Sometimes it was deception. Charlie sensed her hesitation before he saw her. He turned slightly, his eyes narrowing in question. She froze, caught between fear and responsibility. Carefully, deliberately, she raised her hand into his line of sight, palm open, fingers steadying as best she could. She mouthed a single word, slow and clear. Wait. He studied her face, reading something there that made him pause. Permission, unspoken, settled between them. Jennifer stepped closer. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick as she reached toward his ear. Her fingers brushed the edge of his skin, and she felt it, a faint resistance, a foreign presence just beneath the surface. She adjusted her grip, breath shallow, every instinct screaming at her to stop. But she didn't. With a gentle, careful motion, she pulled. It came free far too easily. The object was small, almost insignificant in her hand, darkened with age. Whatever it was, it had been there a long time, too long. Charlie stiffened instantly, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. A sharp jolt rippled through him, and he gripped the arms of his chair as if the room had shifted. Jennifer stepped back, her pulse racing. She watched his face change, first confusion, then shock. His breath hitched, chest rising and falling unevenly. His eyes widened as if something invisible had crashed into him from all sides. He inhaled sharply, then again, slower this time. Sound rushed in where silence had lived for decades. Jennifer didn't need to hear anything to know what was happening. She saw it in his expression, raw and unguarded. The world had just spoken to him for the first time. And in that fragile, terrifying moment, Charlie Johnson realized his silence had never been natural at all. At first, Charlie thought he was dying. The sensation was violent and intimate, like something tearing through him from the inside. His head rang, not with a single noise, but with too many at once, crashing and overlapping in ways his mind had no frame of reference for. He gasped, the sound of it startling him so badly that his hands flew to the arms of the chair, knuckles whitening as he tried to anchor himself. The room was no longer still. Something hummed above him, something ticked nearby. The air itself seemed alive, filled with invisible movement. He could hear his own breath, ragged, uneven, unmistakably real. It terrified him. He had never known that breathing made a sound, that existence announced itself so loudly. Jennifer hovered a few steps away, frozen, the small object clenched in her fingers. She wanted to speak, to explain, but the look on his face stopped her. This wasn't relief yet. This was shock. This was a man whose entire reality had just fractured. Charlie's heartbeat thundered in his ears, each pulse a heavy thud he felt and heard at the same time. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the sounds didn't disappear. They multiplied. Fabric shifting as he moved, the faint scrape of a shoe against the floor when Jennifer instinctively stepped back. Even the silence between noises had texture, a strange, waiting presence. He opened his eyes slowly, afraid of what else might rush in. Jennifer's lips moved, and for the first time in his life, something reached him before his eyes finished reading it. A sound, soft, uncertain, human. "Sir?" The word wasn't clear, not fully formed, but it was there, a vibration shaped into meaning. His breath caught in his throat, and his vision blurred. 37 years of nothing collapsed under the weight of that single syllable. He lifted a shaking hand, pressing his palm against his ear as if trying to push the world back out. Instead, it pressed in harder. The ticking grew louder. His own swallowing echoed inside his skull. Somewhere beyond the walls, a distant honk pierced the air, sharp and startling, making him flinch. He laughed then, an ugly, broken sound that startled them both. He clamped a hand over his mouth, feeling the vibration of it against his skin, stunned by the realization that this noise was coming from him. Jennifer lowered herself slowly into a chair, tears streaming freely now. She nodded again and again as if confirming what she herself could barely believe. The impossible had happened. The condition every specialist had sworn was permanent had vanished in seconds. Charlie forced himself to stand. His legs felt unsteady, as though sound itself had weight. He took a single step, then another, listening to his shoes strike the floor, marveling at the solid certainty of it. But even as awe spread through him, something darker coiled beneath it. Miracles didn't come with debris. They didn't arrive carrying the stench of years lost. His gaze dropped to the object in Jennifer's hand, small, deliberate, hidden. This hadn't been fate. This had been done. And as the city's most powerful man stood trembling in a room suddenly too loud for his soul, one truth began to eclipse the wonder. Someone had stolen his hearing on purpose, and now he could finally hear the lie. The world refused to quiet itself. Charlie spent the first hours trapped between wonder and pain, every sound arriving without permission, without mercy. Footsteps boomed like gunshots, doors whispered, then slammed. Even the rustle of fabric against skin felt amplified, as if the air itself were conspiring to overwhelm him. He pressed his palms against his ears again and again, instinctive gestures that did nothing to stop the flood. Jennifer stayed close but careful, moving slowly, speaking only when she had to. Each word she offered landed unevenly, some clear, others warped, stretching and collapsing before they reached his understanding. Her voice had shape, he realized, weight, emotion. He could hear fear in it, even when her face tried to hide it. He lowered himself onto the edge of the bed in the adjoining room, shoulders tense, jaw clenched. The ticking followed him. It was everywhere now, relentless and precise, counting something he didn't yet understand. Time, perhaps, or the years he had lost. When he drank water, the sound of swallowing startled him so badly he nearly dropped the glass. When he exhaled, it echoed in his chest, loud and intimate, like a confession he hadn't agreed to make. He had lived in control of his body his entire life, and suddenly it betrayed him with noise. Outside, the city breathed. Distant engines rumbled. A horn cried out sharply, followed by another. Somewhere a dog barked, the sound slicing through him with such clarity that he flinched and rose to his feet, heart racing. The city he had ruled for decades was no longer an abstract thing he managed through reports and visuals. It was alive, loud, chaotic. Charlie felt small for the first time in years. He moved to the window, gripping the frame as the street below revealed itself not just in motion, but in sound. Tires hissed against asphalt. Voices overlapped, collided, dissolved. Laughter burst out without warning, raw and careless. He had seen mouths open like that before, but he had never known what escaped them. His breathing grew shallow. The pressure behind his eyes built until the room blurred. Jennifer stepped closer, her voice softer now, grounding. He caught only fragments, but her tone steadied him. He focused on it, on separating her words from the chaos, clinging to that single thread of familiarity. Gradually, the sounds began to organize themselves, not quieter, but less hostile. His mind reached, adapted the way it always had. Years of observation had trained him to categorize the world. Now he was doing it again, this time with sound. Near, far, sharp, dull, threatening, safe. But beneath the adjustment, a grief settled in. Every sound was a reminder of what he had missed. Every laugh an echo of moments that had passed him by. Weddings, arguments, final words spoken at bedsides he had stood beside in silence. When night finally came, the city did not sleep, neither did he. Lying in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of his own heartbeat, Charlie understood that hearing was not a gift gently returned. It was a reckoning. And with every sound the world offered him, one question grew louder than all the rest. Who decided he didn't deserve this?
Charlie sank into the leather chair, letting the weight of the world press him down. And for a moment, he simply listened. Every breath, every tick of the grandfather clock, every distant murmur from the city felt new, alive, impossibly livid. Gratitude swelled inside him, unsteady and raw. For 37 years, silence had been his constant companion, his shield, his prison. And now it had been stolen away by the hands of one quiet, determined woman. Jennifer hovered nearby, careful not to startle him, her eyes bright with tears, her fingers still clutching the small object that had changed everything. Charlie's gaze settled on her, and for the first time in decades, he saw her not as a servant, not as a background figure in his meticulously controlled world, but as the instrument of a miracle. He wanted to speak, to thank her, to reach across the chasm of years and express everything he felt, but words felt fragile, inadequate, swallowed by the magnitude of sound that pressed against his skull from every direction. Then the gratitude began to twist. It was subtle at first, a shadow lurking beneath the wonder. If this had been possible, so simple, so small, why had no one else done it? Why had the doctors, the specialists, the people entrusted with his care allowed him to live in silence for decades? A slow, creeping suspicion began to rise, pulling at the edges of his relief. Gratitude and fear collided, forming a new, sharper awareness. He lifted his hands, flexing his fingers against the polished arms of the chair, and let the sounds of the room fill him. The faint hum of electricity, the subtle creak of floorboards, even the soft whisper of Jennifer's movement. It all had weight, and weight had meaning. He realized that silence had not been natural. Someone had kept it in place, deliberately. Someone had decided he should never hear, never experience the ordinary noises that shaped human life. Jennifer's eyes caught his, and he noticed the tiniest flicker of apprehension. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the evidence of decades lost. That hesitation told him everything he needed to know. She had acted from instinct, compassion, perhaps bravery, but she had also unknowingly walked into a storm. Charlie's silence had been maintained not by fate, but by deception, and now the truth had found him in the hands of someone unprepared for the consequences. A pulse of anger joined the gratitude and fear, threading through his mind like a sharpened blade. Someone had stolen 37 years of his life. Someone had profited from his silence. Someone had dared to manipulate the most dangerous man in the city, blind to the fury that would follow. Gratitude still lingered, fragile and human, but it was now tangled with suspicion and the cold calculation that had built his empire. Charlie's eyes narrowed and his breath slowed, measured, controlled, even as his ears absorbed every subtle nuance of the room. He would find them. Whoever had orchestrated this deception would be exposed, and once he did, they would learn in sound and fury what silence had once shielded him from. The miracle came with a price, and Charlie Johnson had already begun to calculate its cost.
Charlie's steps echoed through the marble halls of Dr. Morrison's office, each click of his shoes amplified in a way that made even the walls seem to flinch. The receptionist flinched first, eyes wide as she tried to hide behind her desk, pen clattering to the floor as she realized who had arrived. Charlie didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every detail, the shallow intake of breath, the trembling fingers, the rapid blink of panic, announced his presence long before he reached the private office. Dr. Morrison emerged, a man carefully groomed, posture rigid, suit tailored to perfection. But even the finest veneer couldn't hide the tremor in his voice, the slight quiver of his hands, the accelerated pulse that betrayed the calm he had once maintained. Charlie's eyes swept over him, taking in every movement, every micro-expression. He had built an empire from observation, and now, for the first time, he could hear the fear that had always been there, lying in wait behind the doctor's practiced words. "Sit," Charlie said quietly, voice rough from disuse, carrying an authority that made the man flinch. "We need to talk about your failure and your lies." The doctor swallowed hard, forcing a nod. Charlie seated himself deliberately, letting the leather chair creak under his weight, each sound a subtle reminder that control had shifted. He could hear the small whine of the air conditioning, the slight rustle of papers as the doctor fumbled to gather himself. Every noise, once meaningless, now told him everything about the man before him. For decades, he had trusted this man, relied on him, allowed him access to the most vulnerable parts of his life. And all that time, Morrison had known the truth, knew that Charlie's deafness was not permanent, knew that the blockage could have been removed, knew that silence had been maintained artificially. And he had done nothing. Or worse, he had profited. The doctor tried to speak, voice quivering, choosing his words with painstaking care, but Charlie could hear the desperation underneath, the falter of syllables that betrayed every lie. "I didn't think," Morrison stammered. Charlie's hand moved subtly, brushing against the desk, and the sound seemed to crack the room open. "You didn't think?" he repeated, voice calm but edged with lethal precision. Do you have any idea what you've stolen from me? The confession tumbled out in broken fragments. Excuses and panic layered over one another, but Charlie didn't flinch. He heard everything, not just the words, but the terror, the guilt, the realization that his deception had been exposed. 37 years of silence, control, calculation, and power had been built on lies and negligence. The doctor's betrayal was not a single act. It was decades of manipulation, deliberate omission, and complicity. Charlie leaned forward, eyes cold, gray, unyielding. Every subtle intake of breath, every faltering heartbeat of the man before him resonated like a drumbeat in his newly awakened consciousness. Do you understand, he said, voice low, each word deliberate, that this changes everything? Every moment you misled me, every second of my life you stole. He paused, letting the weight of silence hang heavy now that he could truly hear it. You will answer for it. The doctor's knees went weak. Charlie stood, the leather chair groaning in protest, and stepped closer, hearing the tremor of fear like music he had longed for, and now wielded. In the sound of betrayal, he found clarity, and in clarity, a promise. Deception would no longer survive in his city. Not from this man, not from anyone.
Charlie stepped out of Dr. Morrison's office into the corridor, each footfall a declaration. The world no longer belonged to shadows and whispers. It belonged to sound, and now he wielded it like a weapon. Every echo in the hall, every distant murmur from the street below carried information, nuance, and power he had never possessed before. Silence had been his ally and his prison. Now, hearing granted him dominion in a new dimension. The city waited beneath him, oblivious to the transformation. Cars honked in the distance, their rhythm chaotic but decipherable. Footsteps hurried on sidewalks, each pace revealing intent, fear, purpose. The faint voices of people arguing, laughing, negotiating, threads he could now follow, untangle, and manipulate. 37 years of a partially blind rule had left gaps. Now he would close them, stitch them with precision, and fill the city with his full awareness. Jennifer's presence lingered in the mansion, her courage having pierced the wall that had constrained him for decades. He thought of her often, not just as the one who restored sound to his ears, but as the one who exposed truth in a world built on lies. Compassion, he realized, was more dangerous than fear. It could dismantle empires, or, if harnessed, forge them anew. Charlie returned to the mansion that evening, the familiar corridors alive with whispers, creaks, and hums. Each step announced him now, carrying authority not just in sight, but in sound. Servants froze mid-task, the subtle quiver of fabric and shuffle of shoes betraying their nervousness. He could hear loyalty, deception, efficiency, and exhaustion in ways he never had before. His world, once a controlled visual map, had become a three-dimensional symphony of power. He sat in his office, the grand mahogany desk no longer a barrier, but a command post. Documents rustled as he moved them, each sound precise, deliberate, a rhythm that mirrored his thoughts. He dialed his lieutenants, his voice now layered with subtle authority, cadence, and menace, and heard the difference it made. Marco's responses, once purely read from lips and gestures, now carried the textures of trust, hesitation, and unspoken urgency. He could hear the truth in tone, the lie in pause, the loyalty in inflection. Charlie's eyes hardened as he contemplated the future. Whoever had stolen 37 years of his life had underestimated him. Whoever had profited from his silence would pay in ways they could not anticipate.
Power, he realized, was no longer just about fear. It was about perception, control, and the mastery of every layer of reality, including sound. And yet, beneath the strategy and menace, a new awareness had taken root. Gratitude, vulnerability, humanity. Jennifer's act had reminded him that even in a world of ruthless calculation, one act of courage could change everything. Charlie Johnson, the Quiet King, was no longer just a master of fear. He was a man reborn in sound, in clarity, in truth. The city waited, unaware that the king who ruled in silence now listened to everything. And with listening came understanding, and with understanding came absolute power. No one would be able to hide, no one would escape, and no lie would endure. In the sound, Charlie found his empire renewed, and himself.